Hello. I'm sure some of you have heard about Sony pulling Spider-Man out of the MCU. Now, I believe there is a reasonable explanation to this, and we should figure this out with calm reasoning.
Screw that. Mother!
Okay, I think there's some sort of logical explanation for this. Probably. Let's go over a brief history of how Sony could do this and how Spider-Man came into the MCU in the first place. Hi everyone, I'm Professor Deadpool. I'm here to explain what the heck is going on. Alright, here's the basics. Let's use a visual aid. Green is Sony and blue is Marvel.
Okay, here's the deal. When Marvel Comics went bankrupt, they actually went bankrupt, they sold off the movie rights for some of their most popular characters, including the Spider-Man characters. Every single one of them. Except, and I'm not 100% sure about this, Miles Morales. In fact, I think that was part of the deal that Marvel made with Sony. Like, we get Peter Parker, you get Miles Morales. And with their sharing arrangement, that means everyone got to share. Yay! Except there was a catch. There always is. Despite the fact that Marvel made the movies themselves, the director, the script, the casting, Sony still got all of the money, 100%. All of the box office, whereas Marvel had to make the money via all the merchandise like Spider-Man toys. Keep in mind this only applies to the Spider-Man solo movies. All the team-up movies are free of Marvel having to pay Sony. The conflict began when Marvel realized, hey, our last Spider-Man movie made over $1 billion and we did all the work. We should get half of the money, which I would argue is reasonable. But then Sony said, we'll pay you about 5%. How do you feel about that? To which Marvel replied, no, we want more money. We deserve it. And then Sony blew it by saying, oh, okay, then we're not re-signing our sharing arrangement, and goodbye. And they took Spider-Man with him. And that's not the worst part. Sony is still planning to make 2 more Spider-Man movies, except without Nick Fury, Happy Hogan, or any of the Stark tech, they can't really make it in the same continuity. But they're planning to, sort of. They can't have any of the MCU stuff anymore. And moving on to how this entire conflict makes no sense. First, how this makes no sense for Disney. Despite the fact that I do agree that the MCU should get some of the profits from these Spider-Man movies, they still have all the merchandising rights, like all the Spider-Man toys. They get all the money from that. Which means that the MCU would make more money than Sony, who still has the rights to these characters. I believe a more reasonable approach to this would be for Disney to split the box office money with Sony like 70-30. So Sony would get 70% of the box office profits and Disney would get 30%. But Sony would also get some amount, maybe like 50% or 30% of the merchandising money. I think that would be a good compromise. But neither Disney or Sony care about my opinion, so I guess that's kind of irrelevant. And now Disney has completely lost Spider-Man in the MCU. But Disney isn't the only one being an idiot. Without the head producer, Kevin Feige, the Spider-Man movies are going to be much worse under the guide of Sony. It's just a fact. They haven't made a good one in a while. Sony was probably emboldened by the success of Venom and thought they could still make a really good Spider-Man movie. I'm not that optimistic. Not to mention fan backlash. Now that this news is very public, who's going to want to see these movies? Who's going to want to see Venom 2? Definitely not as many people. Also, there was some benefit for Sony in this deal. Sony used to single-handedly finance Spider-Man movies. Like, Sony would make them and get the money, and Marvel would pay for them. But the new deal that Disney offered was they would pay for half of it in exchange for half the profits. So, they'd at least not have to spend as much money. So Disney wasn't completely trying to take as much money as possible without giving any back. So based on what I've said about Sony so far, they're definitely going to lose some money because of the scenario. Also, I have a question. Earlier I said that Miles Morales was actually owned by Marvel Studios still. I'm still not 100% sure if that was true, but Sony still wants to make a Spider-Verse sequel. So, did Marvel permanently give them the Miles Morales character? I'm not sure what's going on. Because if they didn't permanently give Sony Miles Morales, then now that the sharing arrangement is over, Sony no longer has their main protagonist for the original Spider-Verse movie, who they would probably want to use in a sequel. Lastly, both companies' movies are now going to have serious plot holes, because the Sony Spider-Man stuff can't mention any MCU stuff, and the MCU stuff no longer can reference Spider-Man, who was set up to be a big part of the Avengers. In conclusion, nobody is winning due to this. Sony isn't winning, they're gonna lose fans. Disney isn't winning, they lost Spider-Man. The fans sure as heck aren't winning. And especially, I'm not winning, because now my best friend isn't going to be in the MCU when I finally get there. And that's about it. Both companies are being idiots. Now that you know all the basics and all the details, back to you, Legoverse man. Thanks, Deadpool. In my opinion, the situation isn't that bad, especially since, given the fan backlash, Sony and Marvel will definitely try to renegotiate. So, it's not the end permanently for MCU Spider-Man. So am I saying you should boycott Disney? No, I'm not. Am I saying you should boycott Sony? Yes, forever. Okay, but in all seriousness, everybody just calm down. It's not the end of the world, and no matter what, just remember this one thing. Spider-Man will return.